The decision to continue was made at 11 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, in good weather, with full provisions and 7 hours of daylight remaining. On the morning of August 14, 1902, 6 members of the Portland Alpine Society departed from the Timberline Lodge on Mount Hood's southern face. Their objective was modest by the standards of the day: a traverse to Cooper Spur via the summit ridge, then descent by the established eastern route. The party consisted of Edward Hollis, aged 41, a surgeon and veteran of 4 previous summit attempts; his wife Catherine, 38, an experienced climber in her own right; James Brennan, 29, a surveyor with the Oregon Land Office; Margaret Voss, 34, a schoolteacher from Salem; Robert Chen, 26, a mining engineer originally from San Francisco; and Henry Dalton, 53, who served as their guide. Dalton had summited Hood 17 times. His logbook, recovered in 1903, indicates he viewed the route as standard fare for competent parties in August conditions. The weather at departure was clear. Temperature at the lodge stood at 62 degrees Fahrenheit. The barometric pressure, recorded by the lodge keeper in his morning entry, measured 30.21 inches and rising. Wind speed was estimated at 5 to 7 miles per hour from the southwest. These conditions, according to subsequent meteorological analysis, suggested stable weather for at least 12 to 18 hours. The party carried ice axes, rope in 3 sections, matches in waterproof tins, a medical kit, compass, maps, whiskey, dried beef, hardtack, chocolate, and 4 wool blankets. Each climber wore layered wool clothing, leather boots with hobnails, and carried personal effects in canvas rucksacks. Their combined equipment, by the standards of alpine practice in 1902, was more than adequate. They moved at a steady pace. Dalton set intervals of 45 minutes climbing, 15 minutes rest. The group maintained cohesion. At each rest stop, Dalton examined the sky, consulted his pocket watch, and noted their position relative to landmarks below. His logbook entries during the ascent are brief and unremarkable. Reached Devil's Kitchen 9:47 a.m. All well. Weather holding. Crater rim 12:33 p.m. Moderate wind from west. Summit by 1:15 p.m. if pace holds. They reached the summit at 1:52 p.m. The view was exceptional. To the south, the Cascade Range extended in clear definition as far as Mount Shasta. The Columbia River basin spread eastward, stippled with farmland and forest. Visibility was estimated at 70 miles. Photographs taken by other climbers that same day from adjacent peaks show Hood summit under cloudless skies. The party remained on top for 19 minutes. Catherine Hollis later described the atmosphere as celebratory but not careless. They ate chocolate and hardtack. Robert Chen took compass bearings. Margaret Voss recorded the names of visible peaks in a small notebook that was never recovered. Edward Hollis examined the thermometer he carried in his vest pocket. 51 degrees at the summit. At 2:11 p.m., Henry Dalton proposed they begin the descent. It was here that the decision was made. The standard route, the one by which they had ascended, descended southwest back to Timberline Lodge. But Dalton suggested the traverse, northeast along the summit ridge to Cooper Spur, then down the eastern slope to Cloud Cap Inn, where arrangements had been made for their retrieval the following morning. The traverse was longer, but it offered varied terrain and avoided retracing their steps. Dalton noted they had ample daylight and good conditions. No one objected. The decision was recorded in Dalton's log with a single sentence: elected traverse route. Party agrees. Conditions favorable. What the entry does not record is that James Brennan hesitated. In his testimony given 14 months later, Brennan stated that he felt a passing unease, but attributed it to fatigue. He did not voice his concern. When asked why, he responded, "It seemed unnecessary. Dalton knew the mountain. The weather was fine. We had hours yet." At 2:14 p.m., the party roped together in 2 groups and began moving northeast along the ridge. The last document suggesting they could have turned back without consequence was written at 2:47 p.m., when they paused at a rock outcropping later identified as Tie-In Rock, approximately 400 yards from the summit. Dalton's log notes: 33 minutes from summit. Ridge traverse proceeding as expected, party strong, weather unchanged. From that position, the return to the standard descent route would have required only 11 minutes. They did not return. The rhythm of the traverse was unhurried. Dalton led the first rope team, himself, followed by Edward Hollis, then Margaret Voss. The second team consisted of Catherine Hollis in front, then Brennan, then Chen. The interval between teams was approximately 30 feet. The terrain along the ridge was exposed but not technically difficult, a mix of consolidated snow, volcanic rock, and short, icy sections that required careful footing but no advanced technique. They moved in silence mostly. The wind had increased slightly, enough to make conversation inconvenient, but not alarming. Dalton called back instructions at irregular intervals. Step left here. Watch the ice. Solid rock ahead. His tone, as later described by survivors, was calm and professional. At 3:10 p.m., the group stopped for water and to adjust rope lengths. The wind was now steady from the west at an estimated 12 to 15 miles per hour. The temperature had dropped. Edward Hollis estimated it at 44 degrees, but this was expected at altitude in late afternoon. The sky remained clear. Chen, who had training in meteorology from his work in high-altitude mining surveys, scanned the horizon and reported no cloud formation of concern. Margaret Voss asked Dalton how much farther to Cooper Spur. He estimated another 90 minutes at current pace, with the descent to Cloud Cap Inn requiring an additional 2 hours after that. Total remaining time, 3.5 hours. Sunset was calculated at 8:03 p.m. They had 4 hours and 53 minutes of usable light. Plenty of time, Dalton said. This phrase, plenty of time, appears repeatedly in the survivor testimonies, always attributed to Dalton, always recalled with a particular weight. It functioned as a kind of refrain, a reassurance offered at each moment of minor uncertainty. When Catherine Hollis mentioned the temperature drop, plenty of time to descend before dark. When Brennan noted the wind increasing, plenty of time, and the wind is from the west. It won't bring weather. The reassurances were not unreasonable. Dalton's experience was genuine. The weather at that moment was still stable. The phrase carried authority, and authority in turn carried comfort. They continued. The traverse required them to navigate a section known as the Knife Edge, a narrow ridge of rock and ice with steep drops on both sides. Dalton crossed first, methodically, testing each foothold. The others followed in sequence, moving slowly, focused entirely on placement and balance. This section took 22 minutes. When they regrouped on the far side at 3:39 p.m., there was a collective sense of accomplishment. The most technical portion of the traverse was behind them. Chen opened a tin of beef and passed it around. They ate standing, still roped together in the wind. The sun was bright. Below them to the east, the Hood River Valley was visible in clear detail. Orchards, roads, the thin line of the railway. It looked close. It looked simple. Margaret Voss later testified that it was during this rest stop that she first noticed clouds forming to the west, low on the horizon, above the coast range. She did not mention it. When asked why, she said, "They seemed very far away, and Mr. Dalton had not remarked on them." At 3:52 p.m., they resumed the traverse. The terrain beyond the knife edge was deceptive. It appeared straightforward, a long, gentle slope of snow angling northeast toward the Cooper Spur ridge. But the snow concealed irregular rock formations beneath, and the slope's angle was steeper than it looked from above. Progress slowed. Dalton began probing the snow with his axe before each step, a precaution against hidden crevasses or unstable substrate. By 4:20 p.m., they had covered less distance than anticipated. Dalton recalculated. Cooper Spur was still 50 minutes ahead, perhaps more. The descent from there would take 2 to 2.5 hours, depending on conditions. They would reach Cloud Cap Inn near dusk, possibly just after. Edward Hollis asked if they should consider turning back. Dalton paused. According to Brennan's testimony, Dalton looked west, toward the summit, then east, toward Cooper Spur. He removed his glove and held his hand up to gauge the wind. Then he shook his head. "We're closer to the inn than the lodge now," he said. "No sense doubling back." This was true. The return to Timberline Lodge would have required retracing the entire traverse, recrossing the knife edge, and descending the standard route in diminishing light. The forward route, though longer in total, seemed more direct. The logic was sound, but it was also the moment when turning back ceased to be a reasonable option. After 4:20 p.m. on August 14, 1902, the party was committed to the eastern descent. No one disagreed with Dalton's assessment. The decision was accepted without discussion. They tightened their ropes and continued. By 4:45 p.m., the clouds Margaret Voss had noticed were no longer confined to the horizon. They had moved inland, rising as they approached the mountain. They were still miles away, still below the summit, but they were no longer abstract. Chen observed them and mentioned to Catherine Hollis that they looked like a front moving in. She agreed, but neither raised the issue with Dalton, who was 30 feet ahead, focused on the route. At 5:03 p.m., the wind shifted. It came now from the northwest, colder, gusting to an estimated 20 miles per hour. The temperature, by Edward Hollis's estimate, had fallen to 38 degrees. Dalton stopped the group and consulted his watch. He announced they would reach Cooper Spur in 20 minutes, then proceed directly down without extended rest. "We'll take our time on the descent," he said, "but we need to keep moving." His tone, Brennan later recalled, had changed. It was still controlled, still authoritative, but there was a new quality to it. Not alarm, but attentiveness. The reassurances had stopped. At 5:19 p.m., they reached the ridge junction that marked the top of Cooper Spur. The descent route dropped sharply to the northeast, a steep snow gully bordered by rock walls. Visibility remained good. The inn was not visible from this elevation, but its location was well known. 4 miles northeast, at the base of the spur, accessible by a clear trail once they reached the tree line. Dalton organized the descent. He would lead again, with Hollis and Voss on his rope. Catherine Hollis, Brennan and Chen would follow. The plan was to descend rapidly but carefully, using a controlled sliding technique on the snow, belayed by the rope teams. At 5:24 p.m. they started down. 4 minutes later, the cloud front reached the summit. The change was not sudden. The clouds did not engulf them all at once. Instead, the light dimmed gradually, as though a veil were being drawn across the sun. The air grew heavier. Visibility decreased in stages. First the distant valleys disappeared, then the tree line, then the details of the slope below them. By 5:40 p.m., they could see perhaps 200 feet ahead. By 5:55 p.m., it was less than 100. The wind increased. Gusts now reached 30 miles per hour, carrying with them a fine, dry snow, not falling from above but lifted from the surface and flung horizontally across the slope. It stung exposed skin. It obscured vision further. Dalton called a halt at 6:02 p.m. They were approximately 1/3 of the way down Cooper Spur, still above the tree line on open snow. The slope continued below them into the cloud, featureless and grey. Dalton gathered the group and conferred with Edward Hollis and Catherine Hollis. His voice, raised against the wind, remained steady. "We need to decide now," he said. "We can continue down carefully, or we can stop and wait for the weather to clear." Edward Hollis asked how long a clearing might take. Dalton said he didn't know. It could be an hour. It could be longer. Chen asked if they could navigate by compass. Dalton said yes, but the slope was steep and uneven, with rock outcroppings and crevasses. In full visibility, it was manageable. In cloud, with darkness approaching, the risk of accident was significant. Brennan asked if they should consider bivouacking, stopping where they were, conserving energy, waiting for morning. Dalton acknowledged this was an option. They had blankets, matches, some food. They could survive a night on the mountain, though it would be uncomfortable. Catherine Hollis pointed out that the inn was expecting them. If they failed to arrive, a search would likely be initiated, but not until morning. No one knew their exact position. A rescue party would need to guess their route. Margaret Voss said nothing. In her later statement, she described feeling a great stillness inside, as though I were watching the conversation from a distance. Dalton made the decision. They would continue down, slowly, roped together, using the compass and the general angle of the slope to guide them. "If we proceed carefully," he said, "we should reach the tree line in an hour, perhaps 90 minutes. From there the route is straightforward." It was 6:09 p.m. They resumed the descent. The wind was now loud enough that communication required shouting. Dalton moved step by step, probing the snow ahead with his axe, testing the surface before committing his weight. Hollis and Voss followed, matching his pace. The second rope team waited until the first had descended 30 feet, then began their own descent. Progress was slow. The slope was steeper than it had appeared from above, and the snow was wind-hardened in some places, soft and unstable in others. At 6:31 p.m., Dalton stopped abruptly. He had encountered a rock band, a vertical drop of perhaps 12 feet, invisible until he was nearly upon it. He signaled for the others to halt. Edward Hollis moved up beside him. Together they examined the obstacle. It was too high to descend safely without a belay. Dalton considered their options. They could traverse left or right along the top of the rock band, looking for a lower section, or they could set up a rappel anchor and lower each climber down. Traversing would take time, with no guarantee of finding a better route. A rappel would be safer, but would also consume time and required a secure anchor point. Dalton chose to traverse left. They moved laterally along the slope for 60 feet before finding a weakness in the rock band, a narrow chute filled with snow. It was steep, but it avoided the vertical drop. They descended through the chute one at a time, belayed from above. This process took 41 minutes. By 7:18 p.m., all 6 climbers had descended the rock band and regrouped below it. They were now approximately halfway down Cooper Spur. Visibility had worsened. The wind carried not just surface snow, but precipitation, small, hard pellets of graupel falling from above. The temperature had dropped below freezing. Dalton checked his watch, though the light was now too dim to read it without striking a match. He announced they had less than an hour of usable daylight remaining. The tree line, he estimated, was still 30 to 40 minutes below them. No one suggested turning back. At this point, the question was no longer whether to continue, but how. They descended in near silence. The wind made speech impossible. Each climber focused entirely on the person ahead, watching for signals, matching their movements. The slope seemed endless. Time diluted. Minutes stretched. At 7:51 p.m., Margaret Voss fell. It was not a long fall. She slipped on a patch of ice, lost her footing, and slid perhaps 20 feet before the rope arrested her. Dalton and Hollis, above her, immediately dropped into self-arrest positions, axes dug into the snow, halting the slide. Voss was uninjured, but the fall had disoriented her. She lay on the slope for several seconds before regaining her feet. When she stood, she began to cry. Not from fear, she later explained, but from exhaustion and cold. Her gloves were soaked. Her hands were numb. She could not feel her feet. Catherine Hollis moved down to her and helped her put on dry gloves from the group's reserve supply. Dalton called a rest. They huddled together, backs to the wind, and assessed their condition. All 6 were cold. All were fatigued, but there were no injuries, and the consensus was that they could continue. Dalton estimated they were 15 to 20 minutes from the tree line. Once in the trees, they would have shelter from the wind. Navigation would be easier. They could rest, build a fire if necessary, then continue to the inn. At 8:02 p.m., they resumed the descent. 1 minute later, the sun set. The darkness was not immediate. There was a period of deep twilight, perhaps 15 minutes, when shapes were still discernible, and the slope remained visible as a gradient of grays. But by 8:20 p.m., the darkness was complete. Cloud, snow, and night merged into a single opacity. Dalton stopped again. He conferred briefly with Edward Hollis. Then he announced they would wait until first light. They were still above the tree line, on open snow exposed to the wind, but further descent in total darkness on uncertain terrain was deemed too dangerous. They would bivouac where they stood. The decision was made at 8:23 p.m. on August 14, 1902, approximately 6 hours and 12 minutes after they had chosen to traverse rather than descend. The group dug a shallow trench in the snow using their axes and boots. They laid out the 4 wool blankets and huddled together in 2 groups, roped together, conserving heat. They had no shelter. They had food, but they did not eat. Their hands were too cold to manage the provisions. They did not light a fire. Matches were too precious, and there was nothing to burn on the open slope. The wind continued. The temperature dropped. Estimates from meteorological records suggest it reached 18 degrees Fahrenheit during the night, with wind chill, bringing the effective temperature below 0. They did not sleep. They shivered. They pressed against one another. They waited. At some point during the night, testimonies differ on the exact time, Henry Dalton stood up. He told the group he was going to scout ahead, to confirm their position relative to the tree line. Edward Hollis protested, but Dalton insisted it would take only a few minutes. He untied himself from the rope and walked down slope into the darkness. He did not return. At first light, which arrived at 6:14 a.m. on August 15th, the 5 remaining climbers searched for Henry Dalton. They found his tracks leading downslope, clear in the fresh snow that had fallen overnight. The tracks continued for approximately 130 feet, then stopped at the edge of a bergschrund, a deep crevasse separating the snowfield from the glacier below. His ice axe was found wedged in the snow at the lip of the crevasse. There was no sign of Dalton himself. Edward Hollis and James Brennan descended partway into the crevasse using the rope, but the depth exceeded their ability to explore safely. They could not see the bottom. They called Dalton's name. There was no response. The decision was made to continue to Cloudcap Inn and organize a rescue party. The descent took 3 hours. The surviving members of the group were suffering from frostbite, exhaustion, and dehydration. Margaret Voss required assistance to walk. Her feet were severely frostbitten. Robert Chen had lost sensation in both hands. They reached Cloudcap Inn at 9:41 a.m. The innkeeper, upon seeing their condition, immediately dispatched riders to alert authorities in Hood River and to summon a rescue team. A search party of 12 men, led by a guide named Thomas Eklund, departed the inn at 1:15 p.m. the same day. They reached the bergschrund by late afternoon but were unable to locate Dalton. The depth of the crevasse, the instability of the surrounding snow, and the approach of darkness forced them to abandon the search until better equipment could be brought up. A second, larger search effort was mounted on August 17th, involving rope specialists and ice climbing equipment brought from Portland. The team descended into the bergschrund to a depth of 80 feet. They found no trace of Henry Dalton. The search was officially called off on August 22, 1902. Dalton was declared lost. His body was never recovered. The inquiry that followed, conducted by the Oregon Alpine Club in cooperation with the Multnomah County Coroner's Office, convened on September 10, 1902. Testimonies were taken from the 5 survivors, from the innkeeper at Cloudcap Inn, from the lodgekeeper at Timberline Lodge, and from several other climbers who had been on Mount Hood on August 14th and 15th. The findings, published in a 17-page report on November 3, 1902, concluded that the tragedy resulted from a series of decisions, each reasonable in isolation, that in aggregate led to an untenable position. The report noted that the weather on August 14th had been unusually stable in the morning and early afternoon, which likely contributed to an underestimation of the rapidity with which conditions could deteriorate. It further noted that Dalton's experience and previous successful climbs may have engendered a confidence that, while not reckless, did not fully account for the specific variables of the traverse route and the late-season weather patterns. The decision to traverse rather than descend was described as within the bounds of reasonable mountaineering judgment at the time it was made, though subsequent developments revealed it to be ill-advised. The decision to continue descent in deteriorating visibility was characterized as a difficult choice with no clear correct answer, made under conditions of increasing stress and diminishing options. Dalton's decision to scout ahead during the night was termed an act of dedication to his party's welfare, though undertaken with insufficient precaution given the conditions. The report made 3 recommendations: that parties on Mount Hood carry lanterns or other portable light sources, that guides establish firmer turnaround times independent of summit success, and that weather observation stations be established at higher elevations to provide more accurate forecasting for alpine routes. None of these recommendations would have saved Henry Dalton. In the months and years following the incident, the survivors provided additional statements, often in response to questions from mountaineering organizations or from historians compiling records of climbing accidents. Edward Hollis, in a letter dated April 12, 1903, wrote, "I have asked myself 1,000 times whether I should have insisted we turn back. The answer is always the same. At every decision point, the forward route seemed reasonable. It was only in aggregate, only in retrospect, that the error became visible." Catherine Hollis, in testimony given to the Mazamas Climbing Club in 1904, stated, "We believed we had time because we had been told we had time, and the person who told us was the person we trusted most. When that trust is mistaken, the result is not recklessness. It is tragedy." James Brennan, in a deposition related to a separate climbing accident in 1908, observed, "People assume hesitation is a failure of will, but we hesitated constantly. We questioned constantly. The problem was not lack of doubt. The problem was that our doubts were always answered, always explained, always made to seem manageable. And so we continued." Margaret Voss, who never climbed again after August 1902, wrote in her private journal in 1911, "I think often of the moment we stood on the summit, eating chocolate in the sun. We were so pleased with ourselves. We had climbed the mountain. What we did not understand was that the mountain was not yet finished with us." Robert Chen, in an interview published in the San Francisco Examiner in 1919, said, "The question everyone asks is, when did you know you were in danger? But that is the wrong question. We knew we were in danger from the moment we left the lodge. The mountain is always dangerous. The question is, when did we know the danger had become unmanageable? And the answer is, too late." A Cloud Cap Inn maintained a register of all climbers who stayed there. The entry for August 14, 1902, was made by the innkeeper in anticipation of the party's arrival. It reads, "Expected party of 6 from Timberline via Summit Traverse. Rooms prepared. Supper ready." The entry for August 15 reads, "Party arrived 9:41 a.m. 5 souls, 1 missing. Guide Dalton lost in crevasse. Search organized." Henry Dalton's name was added to the Mount Hood Memorial plaque in 1903. His age is listed as 53. His occupation is listed as guide and mountaineer. The inscription reads, "Lost on the mountain he knew well." The Bergschrund, where Dalton disappeared, was later named Dalton's Fall, though the name did not appear on official maps until 1927. By then, the crevasse had shifted with the movement of the glacier, and no longer resembled the feature described in the 1902 reports. The traverse route taken by the party, summit to Cooper Spur via the northeast ridge, was not attempted again until 1911, and even then only by a party of experienced climbers in optimal conditions. It has never become a standard route. Most climbers ascending Mount Hood continue to use the southern approach, descending by the same path they ascend. In 1923, a researcher named Paul Hendricks reviewed the meteorological records for August 14th and 15th, 1902, and determined that the cloud front that reached the summit at approximately 5:30 p.m. was the leading edge of a low-pressure system that had formed unexpectedly over the Pacific Northwest. The system brought snow and high winds to the Cascades for 3 days. Hendricks noted that forecasting technology in 1902 was insufficient to predict such rapid development, and even modern methods would have provided only a few hours' warning. He concluded, "The party made decisions based on the best information available to them. That information was incomplete. This is the nature of mountains." The disappearance of Henry Dalton on Mount Hood in August 1902 is not remembered as a dramatic event. It produced no headlines beyond the regional newspapers of Oregon. It prompted no major reforms in mountaineering practice. It resulted in no legal proceedings, no scandals, no contested narratives. The inquiry was thorough, the conclusions were accepted, and the survivors returned to their lives. Edward and Catherine Hollis continued to climb, though never again on Hood. Margaret Voss became a librarian. James Brennan moved to Seattle. Robert Chen returned to mining work in Nevada. The incident appears in mountaineering histories as a footnote, an example of the ordinary dangers of alpine travel in the early 20th century. It is classified as a judgment error compounded by environmental factors, a category that encompasses hundreds of similar incidents across the mountain ranges of North America. But the ordinariness of the tragedy is, in a sense, its most unsettling feature. There was no singular catastrophic mistake. There was no moment of recklessness, no act of defiance against obvious danger. The decisions made by Henry Dalton and the members of his party were, at each juncture, defensible. They were based on experience, on observation, on the accumulated wisdom of mountaineering practice. They were the decisions that reasonable people make when they believe they have time. The archive materials related to the incident, Dalton's logbook, the testimonies, the inquiry report, the letters and journal entries of the survivors, reveal a consistent theme: the persistent belief, even as conditions worsened, that the situation remained manageable. The weather was bad, but not unprecedented. The visibility was poor, but they had a compass. The descent was difficult, but they were experienced. The darkness was coming, but the tree line was close. Each assessment was accurate, each was also insufficient. The danger was not that they failed to perceive risk. The danger was that they perceived it, acknowledged it, and concluded, over and over again, that it could be managed. They believed they had margins. They believed in their own competence. They believed, until they could no longer believe it, that there was still time to correct course. This belief was not irrational. It was the product of a certain kind of rationality, one that weighs known factors, applies past experience, and reaches conclusions based on probabilities. It is the rationality that allows human beings to function in conditions of uncertainty. It is also the rationality that fails when the margins are smaller than they appear. The moment when turning back ceased to be a viable option was not marked by any event. It was not the result of a sudden storm, a fall, an injury. It was simply the passage of time, the accumulation of small delays, the slow erosion of alternatives. At 2:11 p.m., they could have descended safely by the standard route. At 3:52 p.m., they were committed to the traverse. At 6:09 p.m., they were descending into cloud. At 8:23 p.m., they were bivouacking on open snow. The transitions between these states were seamless. There was no alarm, no panic, no recognition that a threshold had been crossed. There was only the steady, calm continuation of forward movement, guided by the assumption that the situation, while challenging, remained under control. Henry Dalton's final decision, to scout ahead during the night, has been the subject of particular scrutiny. Some have characterized it as an error born of fatigue and cold, a lapse in judgment by a man who had been awake and active for more than 24 hours. Others have viewed it as a selfless act, an attempt to gather information that might improve the group's chances of survival. The truth, insofar as it can be determined from the surviving evidence, is likely more prosaic. Dalton believed the tree line was close. He believed he could confirm this quickly. He believed the risk was minimal. He was wrong. His tracks, measured the following morning, showed that he had walked in a straight line downslope for 130 feet. There was no indication of stumbling or disorientation. He had been moving purposefully. The bergschrund that stopped him was not visible in the darkness and the blowing snow. It was simply there, an absence where solid ground should have been. The survivors did not blame him. In their testimonies, they spoke of Dalton with consistent respect and sorrow. They did not question his competence or his intentions. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, that competence and good intentions are not always sufficient. Margaret Voss, in her journal entry from 1911, wrote, "We climbed the mountain as though it were a problem to be solved. We believed that with enough skill, Enough preparation, enough care, we could move through it safely. And we were nearly right. Nearly. But mountains do not grade on a curve. There is no credit for nearly. The phrase, "plenty of time," Dalton's repeated reassurance throughout the day, appears in the inquiry report as an example of what the investigators termed progressive commitment bias. Each decision to continue reinforced the narrative that continuation was correct, which in turn made further continuation seem more justified. The bias is not unique to mountaineering. It appears in accounts of maritime disasters, aviation accidents, business failures, military defeats. It is the human tendency to believe that forward progress is inherently safer than retreat, that perseverance is inherently wiser than abandonment. But the bias, like all biases, rests on an assumption that the future will resemble the past, that trends will continue, that margins will hold. When the assumption fails, the bias becomes lethal. The inquiry report concluded with a single recommendation that has been largely ignored in subsequent mountaineering literature. It suggested that parties establish before departure a series of objective turnaround criteria, specific times, specific locations, specific weather thresholds, that would trigger retreat regardless of progress or proximity to the goal. The recommendation assumed that climbers, if presented with objective data, would make objective decisions. It assumed that the problem was one of information, not interpretation. It assumed that people, when faced with evidence that they should turn back, would turn back. The assumption was optimistic. 63 years after the disappearance of Henry Dalton, a researcher named Ellen Crawley interviewed the surviving family members of the 1902 party for an oral history project on early mountaineering in Oregon. One of her subjects was the nephew of Robert Chen, who had inherited Chen's papers and climbing journals. In a letter Chen wrote to a friend in 1920, never published, never previously cited, he described a recurring dream he had about the descent. In the dream, he is back on the slope, in the cloud, in the dark. But this time, he speaks up. He tells Dalton they should stop. He insists. He refuses to continue. And in the dream, Dalton listens. They bivouac higher on the mountain, in a more sheltered location. They survive the night. At dawn, they descend together, all 6 of them, and reach the inn by midday. Chen wrote, "I have this dream perhaps once a month. It is always the same. And when I wake, I remember that I did not speak. I did not insist. I believed, as we all believed, that there was still time. And I wonder if that belief, more than the cold or the darkness or the crevasse, is what killed Henry Dalton." The archival file on the 1902 Mount Hood incident is housed in the Oregon Historical Society in a climate-controlled storage facility in Portland. It consists of 83 pages of typed and handwritten documents, 2 photographs, 1 sketch map, and a small leather-bound logbook with water damage on the final pages. The file is consulted infrequently. Most researchers interested in mountaineering history focus on more dramatic incidents, on larger peaks, on famous climbers. The story of Henry Dalton and the Party of 6 is too quiet, too ordinary, too lacking in spectacle. But the file remains. The documents are preserved, the testimony is recorded, and the final entry in Henry Dalton's logbook, written at 2:47 p.m. on August 14, 1902, at Tie-In Rock, 400 yards from the summit, 11 minutes from safety, reads, "Party strong. Weather unchanged. They had plenty of time. They were wrong.